Let me just preface anything I say in this video by admitting the fact that I've met a lot of amazing Protestants, especially in that time prior to my joining the Catholic Church, that time of exploration and meeting people from different faith persuasions. I met so many people who were obviously sincere witnesses of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus and people of goodwill who were doing their best, and there was obviously supernatural graces evident in their lives. But the more I learned about Protestantism, the more I studied it, the more I encountered things that, looking back, I think that so many of those people would have been shocked to learn about themselves. And I wonder if they had been shared these things, that they would continue to identify with even just that general pedigree of Protestantism that all of these various denominations are descended from. Simultaneously, would they be surprised to learn that many of the myths that are popularly believed about Catholicism are simply not true? Like, a lot of casual observers believe that Protestantism ushered in an age of egalitarianism, whereas Catholicism was always hyper committed to hierarchy and the stratification of society. I've heard many people say that Protestantism also pushed back against Catholic imperialism and religious intolerantism and the Crusades and the evils of the Inquisition and on and on. But there are several key novel ideas that were introduced by the Protestant Reformation and the so-called Reformers that most people, especially those casual observers, are less familiar with and might be surprised or even shocked to learn about. I know that every time I was exposed to these details, I came away feeling a bit shocked myself, especially when I, again, was investigating Christianity as a new convert. And the first thing that I'll share, which might be surprising or even shocking to some people, is that the Protestant Reformers didn't believe in the supernatural, or specifically miracles. In fact, they claimed that miracles were not part of the life of the church anymore, that Christians are actually incapable of performing miracles, which is obviously surprising given the fact that many sects of modern Protestantism are, I would say, hyper-focused on the supernatural. They tend to want to interpret every event as being influenced by miraculous or divine intervention, like babbling, they will claim, is a supernatural sign, which can easily be explained naturally. So this tendency to want to explain everything supernaturally is a bit dangerous, because most of what happens is natural, not supernatural. Miracles and divine interventions are the exception, and arguably the rare exception. But the reason that the Reformers were so opposed to the idea that miracles ever occur in the church today is because they were conspicuously absent from their communities in the early days of the Reformation. They couldn't do them, and Catholics reacting to their movement saw this as evidence that God was clearly not on their side. They would point to all the miracles that Catholic saints are known for, and then they would say, if you really are the true people of God, where are your signs and miracles? And I think this is a pretty reasonable request if you know what the purpose of miracles are. Miracles are proof of divine origin. Jesus performed miracles to show that he was truly the Son of God, that he was sent from God. The Protestant Reformation at this point was rupturing the very fabric of religious and cultural life in Europe. If that movement was going to lay claim to being a restoration of the true church, it wasn't an unreasonable thing to expect them to back it up with supernatural signs, given everything that was at stake. But the Protestants replied by saying, well, actually, miracles don't happen anymore, so don't expect us to perform them for you, even though we are God's true church. For example, in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, John Calvin reacted harshly to those asking for signs affirming the truth of his teaching by accusing them of just being liars, which is a strange way to respond to a question, I think. He went on to claim that the Gospels actually teach that miracles came to an end in the apostolic age, which is a hard thing to argue, if you ask me. The next thing that might be surprising to many is that Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, the root that the whole movement is descended from, taught some truly insane things, which is important to know because some Protestants regard him as something like a canonized saint. Now, some of these records are based on things Luther supposedly verbally said to friends in a collection called Table Talk, which were collected in volumes known as Luther's Works, with the Weimar edition being one of the more commonly cited comprehensive editions. Now, some object to these quotes being referenced because they are secondhand. They were written down by Luther's friends and his pupils and his colleagues, but here's the thing, that's how history works. The sayings of Socrates and Jesus himself are all secondhand. In one passage, Luther is claimed to have said this: Christ first became an adulterer at the well with the woman, again with Mary Magdalene, again with the adulteress whom he dismissed so lightly. Thus, the righteous Christ must first become also an adulterer before he died. Now, there's no context to that quote, so it's hard to know what the heck he was talking about. Maybe this was just an evening with friends where they had too much to drink, but nonetheless, it's a pretty crazy and even blasphemous thing to say. Speaking of the 10 Commandments, which God and Christ commanded us to observe, Luther says this: They give good instructions, but no assistance. They teach what man should do, but give no power to do it. Hence, they are only fitted to show a man his own incapacity for goodness, and to make him despair of himself. In other words, God only gave us the 10 Commandments so that we would fail in attempting them, like a cruel cosmic joke. Which, yeah, admittedly, some of the 10 Commandments are difficult to observe, but a lot of them just depend on our goodwill, like loving God and not being idolaters, like not using the Lord's name in vain, like keeping the Sabbath holy, honoring your father and mother, don't steal, don't murder, don't lie. I mean, maybe that's a high standard for some people, but it isn't unreasonable. He also said this pretty shocking thing about the 10 Commandments. He said, if Moses should attempt to intimidate you with his stupid 10 Commandments, tell him right out, chase yourself to the Jews. And I could quote more of Luther on the Jews, but my video would definitely get taken down, which should give you an idea of how hostile he was towards the Jews and how egregious some of the things he said about them were, even those particular Jews in the Bible. Luther also famously taught that man has no free will, and I know this is surprising to a lot of Lutherans because they always, whenever I make this claim, they say that no, that was John Calvin. But no, when it applies to salvation, Luther taught this too. In On the Bondage of the Will, which was Luther's writing, one of his works, he said this: with regard to God and all that bears on salvation or damnation, man has no free will, but is a captive prisoner and bondslave either to the will of God or to the will of Satan. This stems from his view of salvation as being a free gift of grace, which of course it absolutely is, but somehow Luther arrived at the conclusion that if we cooperate with grace, then it can no longer be called grace, which of course doesn't follow logically at all. If I give you a gift and you just throw it in the garbage, it's still a gift. The fact that you threw it away just makes you a bad person. And so is the case with grace. Grace is a free gift. We either receive it and allow it to transform us, or we reject it. But there's definitely a dimension of our choice in the matter, and whether we receive it or reject it doesn't change the fact that it is grace and it's a gift. This is why he also says of Judas, that he says this, quote, his will was the work of God. God, by his almighty power, moved his will as he does all that is in the world. In other words, God performed the betrayal, not Judas of his own will. And this is just where faith alone theology kind of binds you up in conclusions that you would rather avoid, I would think. Something else that seems to be barely known or understood about Luther and the other reformers is that they were fideists. And now, if you're not familiar with that word, to understand what it means, you have to understand that from the earliest days of the church, there was like this tension between faith and reason. Both of these were considered forms of knowledge of the truth. Reason tells us about the things that we can know through our own power of mind, our faculties of reason. Faith tells us about the things that we can only know when God reveals them to us. For example, we can know that God exists through reason. That's not a doctrine of faith. But we can't know that God is Trinity, or why or how he created the world, or that God sent his son for our salvation. Those are the kinds of things that God has to tell us, because our reason, by virtue of, our obviously finite limitations, we simply can't know those things. And the Catholic Church always held that both forms of knowledge are valid and cannot contradict, which is why there is this great intellectual tradition in the Church of pursuing and nurturing reason and faith together, finding its climax, I would argue, in St. Thomas Aquinas and scholasticism. But Luther believed that human faculties were so compromised by sin that we couldn't possibly trust human reason to tell us anything valid. Regarding reason, he said this: Reason is the greatest enemy that faith has. It never comes to the aid of spiritual things, but more frequently than not struggles against the divine word, treating with contempt all that emanates from God. He also referred to reason as the devil's bride and as a whore that could not be trusted. These were the first hints that there would be trouble between the disciplines of faith and reason in the future. Up until that point, Catholicism took an active role in promoting science and reason, founding the first universities and funding all of the scientific research that was out there. But after Protestantism, Christianity was seen as something like hostile towards the pursuits of reason. And you can't blame people for thinking that, given what Luther had said. So the Protestant Reformers were fideists, fide meaning faith in Latin. Fideist is one who prefers faith as a form of knowledge over reason. So faith alone had kind of a double meaning for Protestants. It applied to the question of salvation, but also to epistemology or to knowledge. The next surprising detail stands in sharp contrast to modern man's belief that in the scope of all of human history, we modern people have the most freedom and flexibility in our lives. We often congratulate ourselves for abolishing slavery and the tyranny of systems like feudalism. It's obvious to us that our work obligations are far more humane today than they were in, say, the Catholic Dark Ages. But I expect that it would surprise most people to learn that farm workers in feudal agrarian communities in the Middle Ages enjoyed a lot of vacation time. When the harvest was complete, they would often take months off of work, in some cases like half the year. They also enjoyed a litany of holy days. This is where the word holiday actually comes from, which were Catholic feasts that commemorated important saints and religious devotion in the liturgical calendar, which was eventually abolished by the Protestants. Some of these feasts would last for entire weeks, and the working class knew they were entitled to enjoy the revelry all the way through. And this was by the design of the Catholic Church to shape society based on the idea that leisure is our highest purpose in life. We work so that we can enjoy leisure. We only work as much as is necessary as a consequence of the fall. We do our work until it's done, and then we return to leisure. Work is in the service of leisure. But Luther, and especially John Calvin, wanted to remove any distinction between the clergy and the religious, or what was known as the first estate, and the working class, or the third estate. So they taught that work like mopping the floor or milling wheat or plowing the field was just as high a calling or activity as prayer was. Then they abolished all those Catholic holy days so that we wouldn't lose focus of the important part of life, which is work. This had the effect of transforming our perception of work as a necessary evil to a replacement of leisure as our highest calling. Sociologist Max Weber went on to label this effect as the Protestant work ethic, which he argued was the necessary seed to what would eventually become the systems of capitalism that we now live under, in which our whole lives are anchored by our work. Today, we get 2 to 3 weeks of vacation, few to no allowances for religious observances or feast days, and arbitrarily defined work hours. We don't stop working when the work is complete like those medieval peasants did. We keep working until the clock says that we can go home. Another surprising detail is that Protestants were far more fanatically obsessed with witch hunts and witch trials. Though this is often something that Catholics are accused of with reference to like the Inquisition. But the Inquisition was actually historically ambivalent towards witchcraft, claiming that it was just largely a pagan superstition and not worth paying much attention to. But Protestants were big on witch hunts and witch trials, which reached a fever pitch in the later 16th century once those Protestant territories were becoming well established, especially in Germany. Germany was the hotbed, no pun intended, of both Protestantism and witch trials. And yes, this spilled into Catholic territories in Germany as well, but considering the fact that the church had always taken a very skeptical view of the existence of witchcraft, it's likely that this wave of obsession originated in the Protestant hysteria. A big giveaway of this contrast was in the New World. Witch trials were infamous in Puritan colonies and communities like Salem, but this kind of thing was virtually unheard of in Spanish and Portuguese territories, again because the Inquisition held firm to the view that witchcraft was just a harmless pagan superstition. And I'll say that this is my own speculation, but considering Protestants refused to believe in supernatural miracles, it might account for why they were so quick to view anything that exceeded natural knowledge or ability as demonic. They refused to believe in miracles, so when they occurred, what explanation are you left with other than witchcraft? The last thing that might come as a surprise is that Protestants weren't the first to translate the Bible into the vernacular. It's often claimed that Protestants fought and died to liberate the Bible from the clutches of the Catholic Church, who wanted to keep it out of the hands of the people. But history tells a very different story. For example, the Vulgate, which is the first Latin translation of the Bible, was a work done by Saint Jerome at the instruction of the Pope, in order to make the Bible more accessible to a much more common and universal language in the West, which was Latin. In the 7th and 8th centuries, there were several translations of the Bible into Old English attributed to Aldhelm and Saint Bede, the Venerable, another Catholic saint. There were also the Wessex Gospels in the 10th century that were those early Old English translations. Prior to Martin Luther's translation of the Bible into German, which is often the first thing that people will say as the first German translation, there were several earlier German translations, like the Mentalin Bible, the Lübecker Bible, and the Ottmar Bible. And then before the King James Bible, Catholic scholars created the Douay Rheims Bible in English. Now, to be honest, there was a lot more that I wanted to include in this video, but instead of taking more time, this video is long enough as it is, I'll invite you to share some more examples of surprising things about Protestantism in contrast to popular myths about Catholicism in the comments below. Okay, thanks for watching. These videos and this channel are only possible because of viewer support, so if you can spare some help, please consider making a contribution through my website at brianholdsworth.ca, or join my locals community at brianholdsworth.locals.com, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded individuals. We actually just started a monthly Zoom meetup where we're studying some articles of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. So if that's interesting to you, then come join us there. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.